Everybody hear me okay with the mic not too loud, too much? Okay. Thank you, Dave. It was incredibly difficult for Dave with his Penn State roots to utter the word Ohio State, so I appreciate the practice that he put into doing that. Also, Abbott stole one of my lines. I was going to make some comments about the front row, but I'll just add to that by saying that later when I request volunteers, I'll begin with the back row. Forward that way. What I want to talk with you about today are some topics that I am very passionate about, things that have sort of developed for me over probably the last 10 years. And some of them are, on the surface, perhaps unrelated. I think I've found a way to kind of integrate them, to talk about them in a way that is, I hope, meaningful for all of you today, and that you walk away from today's address with at least some food for thought. I want to talk with you about my ideas for and about what I'm calling transformational innovation in education. I want to also talk about what I think transformational innovation means for P-12 educators, as well as for those of us in higher education settings. And finally, I want to leave you with a model that I developed as a comprehensive integrated model to achieve these kinds of transformational innovations, but in doing so as a mechanism to empower us as practicing educators. And along those lines, hopefully, they'll provide some inspiration for at least some of you as well. So what I'd like to start off with as means of an introduction is just the notion of the fact that for well over 50 years in this country, we've been heeding calls for improvements in education and reform in education and change in education and all kinds of things, all kinds of terms that I'm going to talk a little bit more about in a minute. I think that those kinds of things are essential, but I think that we've reached a point in our educational systems, and all we have to do is begin to factor in the multitude of budget cuts at various levels of education to realize that we've got to begin to do some things a little bit differently. And in my estimation, do things that are more powerful, that can perhaps lead to bigger and stronger impacts in our educational settings, regardless of where they may be. So I think that those kinds of ideas are essential to what we're trying to do, but I don't think that they're enough anymore. I think that what we need is, first of all, some stronger language. The term improvement, to me, is it's sort of a soft term. We want to improve. Well, who doesn't want to improve? We always want to improve. But I just don't think that that as a term to really sort of identify and signify what it is we want to trying to accomplish is really strong enough. Now, related to that, I think that in addition to some stronger language, we need to have movements that are associated with those terms that stand to be much more influential in our fields. If you think about this for a second, and you think about that time frame, the last 50 years or so, and you think about improvements that we've seen in education in general, if you factor out, this is statistician in me right now, if we factor out the effects and the impact that advanced instructional technologies have had on our educational systems, I think that arguably, admittedly and arguably, but generally speaking, that education over those years tends to look very similar today as to what it did 50 years ago. Now, I mean, we can argue bits and pieces of that, but please understand that I'm trying to talk in generalities about that. So, the attire is a little different. Look at how much more clutter there is on the desk, too. But they're still in rows, and I realize not every class is taught in rows, but, okay? But the setting and the format of that is really very similar to the way it's been for many decades. So let me get back to this notion of some of these terms and sort of how I view these terms. When we talk about this as a general area of educational research or educational reform, if you will, we have all kinds of terms that we sort of tend to throw around and use interchangeably. Reform, change, which is another, change just means it's not the same. Doesn't necessarily mean it's better. Doesn't necessarily mean it's an improvement. And then we have the word improvement. Versus things like transformations, which in my mind, the connotation of that kind of word is much stronger. We can also talk about and sort of debate the notions of creativity versus innovation. And I'm going to talk more about those in a few minutes. The one thing that I can tell you, at least from my perspective, and I'll expand on this in just a minute, is the fact that I don't believe that change is the same thing as reform. Those are very different ideas. They're very different entities. How they play out in educational settings, I think, is very, very different. So, what are we really talking about? What do we really mean when we talk about these kinds of terms? When we talk about improvement and reform and creativity? Well, if you'll bear with me for a little bit, because it leads into really the focus of my talk today, I want to share with you sort of some formal definitions of some of these terms, and then how I see them fitting with our educational systems. First of all, let's look at the word reform. A formal definition of the word reform is the change or improvement of something wrong. Now that's a key component of that definition. The implication here is that before we can change or improve anything, we have to be sure that we understand the entity that is, quote unquote, wrong. And from an educational research perspective, I'm not really sure that over those decades that I mentioned, that we have become really good at identifying the things that are wrong with our educational systems. Now don't get me wrong, I think we can identify areas of concern, but one of the things that I always like to really stress with research methods students when I teach them is the fact that when we talk about educational research, 99.9% of the time we're researching human beings. And to try to identify a single or even a couple of causes for things that are wrong in our educational systems is an incredibly difficult and next to impossible thing to do, because we're talking about human beings and the multitude of things that go into making up human beings and human behavior. Now I realize that we could probably argue this for the next 45 or 50 minutes as well, and probably beyond, but generally speaking, I'm not sure in this country if we've ever really seen the effective implementation of large-scale reform. I think that we've had movements and things that may have been, at the outset, initiatives that could lead to large-scale reform, and probably one of the first ones that comes to mind for me is, back in the 60s and 70s, with the advent of the space race and really trying to step up our math and science instruction in this country, I think had the potential to be one of those kinds of really large-scale reform efforts. And again, arguably, I'm not sure if in this country over those 50 years that we've really been successful in achieving those goals. There obviously is a lot more that we could do. How about creativity? You'll hear people say, well, the problem with school is that we're not creative enough. We need to be more creative. If you look at a formal definition of creativity, the idea behind creativity is that something new is developed and that new thing has value of some sort. The key here for me is that something new is being developed. Now, I'm not sure when we look at situations in our educational settings and we talk about improving or changing the things that we do, that we ever really entertain the notion of developing something new. I'm not sure what something new in P12 education would look like. I don't think that that's really the approach that we take. Usually what we do is that we find areas in need of attention, improvement, change, and then we adapt those and we try to build on those. But I am not really sure that we have, in any time in recent history, developed something, again, educational technologies, instructional technologies notwithstanding, that has really been new. And in order for something to be a creative entity, or for us to experience that creativity formally defined, we would have to have that component. So if you think about reform for a second, and I'm going to really speak now more about P12 settings than higher ed, although a lot of this could transfer over into higher ed as well. But over the years, as I've spent time in public schools and working with teachers and being in their classrooms, one of the things that I began to notice over the years is that behind the teacher's desk in the corner of the room, there were usually a set of bookshelves. And up on those bookshelves, usually on the very top shelf that you couldn't reach without stepping on some sort of a box to get up to them, was a series of binders. All different thicknesses, all different colors. And there seemed to be some sort of a correlation between the number of binders on the shelf and the number of years that the person had been a teacher. So after a while, I started to ask questions. What are all these binders up on the shelves? And the answer that I routinely got, regardless of who the individual was, is that these were the reform initiatives that were being undertaken in the school. And I said, "You're doing all of those things?" And the response was typically, "No, this one was from 3 years ago, and this one is from last year, and this is the one that we're doing this year." And so the idea that is sort of being perpetuated is that reform and change in public schools is somehow equated with the receipt of a new binder every August. And when you take that notion of reform, combine it with your new binder, you're left with TYNT, or this year's new thing. Now, I'm not saying that all of those efforts are futile and should not be engaged in and so forth, but the idea that we're trying to get our practicing P12 educators to engage in different, oftentimes, reform efforts every year, or even if it's every couple of years, is a really overwhelming thing for them. What I would like to argue with you today is that I think we're past the stage of reform. I think what we really need is to transform. And my contention, and where I would like to focus the rest of my talk, is that what we need to see is a complete transformation in what we do and how we do it into something that's entirely different. Not necessarily new, but different. So let me present you with another option and some different terminology that we'll build on from this point forward. Transformation. Formal definition of transformation is a change or alteration, especially a radical one, within an existing entity. Now, just on the surface, that seems to me to be a lot more like the kinds of things that I was describing to you earlier. The idea that we've got this existing entity, and we need to alter it. Sometimes mildly, sometimes very radically. But it's already existing. That seems to sort of flow and mesh a little bit better with, I think, what we do as practicing educators. In order to be able to do this, what I think that we as educators have to be able to do is not only change the decisions that we make, but change the way we go about making decisions. We also need to consciously choose to do things differently, otherwise we can't have these alterations or radical changes. And then choose to make decisions that are outside the norm. And I sort of tend to prefer that saying as opposed to the other one that's a little bit overused, I think. Okay? We don't need to think necessarily outside of anything other than just the norm, what we typically do. Second term is innovation. Innovation, and as most of you know, a lot of times, innovation is used synonymously with creativity. But based on the formal definitions, they're very different things. Innovation is a process that renews something that previously exists. Very different from the definition of creativity where we had to develop something new. Okay? So the idea that we're renewing something that previously exists, first of all, what I hope that you see with these two definitions is that there's a lot of overlap. So combining them, I think, is sort of makes logical sense. So if you combine these two definitions, and we talk about the notion of radically changing or renewing existing systems or entities within our context, then what I would argue that we were doing, or what we have, is transformational innovation. But perhaps the first big question that I have for all of you, myself included, can we do this? As practicing educators, can we do these kinds of things? And the reason that I pose that question is really not from a rhetorical perspective, but really concretely, can we do these kinds of things? You know, when we think about large-scale innovations in particular, I think we typically tend to think of those as somebody else's work. Those are things that happen in think tanks across the country, and those are things that happen at big Research One institutions that get multi-million-dollar grants for multi-year projects to really develop innovations. We don't typically think of these kinds of things as things that are done at the grassroots level, the classroom level, the level of instruction in higher education settings. However, I do firmly believe that it is possible for us to do these kinds of things, to begin our own transformational innovations. But in order to be able to do that, there are 5 key components to this model that I want to walk through with you, because I think that all 5 are critical in terms of us being able to do these kinds of things. The first one is an acronym that I sort of coined, if you will, at my 2008 presidential address to the Midwestern Educational Research Association. DDITM, which stands for Data-Driven Instructional Decision Making. What, over the past couple of years, I've really decided was that term, that acronym, was a little bit limiting, so I've decided to remove the I and replace it with an E and talk about DDETM, or data-driven educational decision-making, because I think that we make a lot of decisions in education that are not necessarily related directly to instruction, but still have a great deal of importance in terms of our educational settings, contexts, and environments. When I talk about DDETM, the idea that I have behind this is the idea that for many, many decades, when we thought of teaching, when we thought of providing instruction and helping students learn, I think that we typically tended to think of teaching as more of an art form. Now, we could help teach people skills, but there was a certain amount of just sort of understanding of the context, understanding of the setting, understanding of your individual students, and then a lot of decisions that were made were based on gut instinct. How many teachers have you ever talked to during your careers when you've engaged them in a conversation about something that some aspect of their instruction, some content, some standards that their students struggle with, year in and year out? And you talk to them about, well, how do you know they struggle with this? Well, they don't perform well on the unit tests, and they don't really ask questions. And if you press them a little bit and ask them, how do you really know that they're not understanding this? Or, conversely, how do you know they do understand it? How many times have you heard teachers say, I can just tell? You know, I can just feel it in my gut. I can tell. I can see it when I look out at them. They're smiling, they're nodding, they understand it. Or I'm writing on the board and I turn around and I look and ask if there are any questions, and 2/3 of the class is looking at me like this. You know? Now, I don't mean to take anything away from that, because that's a valuable part of teaching. And part of that, I think, is really the art of teaching. The idea that you have to, when you're standing up in front of a classroom, you have to be able to sort of gauge and sense where students are. That's a valuable part of what we do every day. However, I think that we've reached a point now, and I really saw this start to emerge and sort of permeate public schools a lot more about 10 years ago. And ever since then, every year, I think it sort of grows exponentially in terms of school districts' focus on this kind of thinking. And a lot of it, for better or worse, and I don't want to argue that point, but I think it just is what it is, a lot of that has come as a result of the accountability movement and the responsibilities that we place on teachers, administrators, school districts in general, to make sure that students are achieving what they're supposed to achieve. But this notion of the science of teaching is much more evidence-based. It's the idea of collecting data on student performance or on student perceptions, and I'm going to talk more about data in a minute. The idea that we then use those kinds of things to make decisions that are a little bit better informed than just those that we would be making from that sort of gut instinct. Now, that being said, I don't ever want to take away the art of teaching. I see this as something in addition to the art of teaching. Because there are people, and we all know people in their classrooms who are true artists. They understand kids, they understand their content, they know how to teach that content, their kids do well, but as we all know, that's not necessarily the norm across every classroom in this country. Okay. So what I really think that we're getting to is a point where the art of teaching is really transforming in and of itself to become, or to be joined by, the science of teaching. The idea that we have a more systematic, and I'll use this term sort of loosely, but scientific basis for making educational decisions. As a simple way to kind of explain to you what I mean, I've got this very brief four-step process. And when you look at this, this is not going to be rocket science. It's not going to be something that is really brand new and creative. Okay? But the idea here is, as a systematic method of making decisions in education, the idea that we begin by generating an idea, then implementing that idea, assessing its effectiveness, reflecting on that process and on our assessments, and then using the outcome of this professional reflection to guide a next round of systematic decision-making. What is implicit in this model is that there's a lot of trial and error in what we do. There was always a ton of trial and error when we were relying on the idea of the art of teaching. We would try something. If the kids got it, we would keep doing it. If they didn't get it, we would try something new, or we would adapt that. Okay? Teachers have been doing that since the beginning of formalized education in this country. But the one, or maybe I should say the two pieces of this model that I don't think have sort of been a consistent and integral part of this kind of trial and error process is the last two steps. The idea that we concretely assess the effectiveness of something that we've done, and then really and truly engage in professional reflection on that process, and use that information to guide what we do. In my mind, that in and of itself makes this process much more systematic. And again, I'll use the term loosely, but more scientific. And by that I just mean it's more thorough, it's more step-by-step kind of a process. Okay? Now, for those of you who are familiar with this notion, and for those of you who might be familiar with any of my work, one of the things that should not surprise you is that this really is just a simplified version of action research. The idea that we're trying things in our settings, we need to assess those things and how well they worked, look back on them to see how we could maybe improve upon them the next time, and then go through subsequent cycles. I'm going to share with you a couple of models, and I know you can't see the details of these, but these are two models of the process of action research. These are taken from my action research book entitled Action Research, Improving Schools and Empowering Educators. They're just variations of the same theme, but if you look at this one, there are 4 steps in that process: planning, acting, developing, and reflecting. Very similar to the brief linear diagram that I just showed you. But you'll notice then that the outcome from the reflecting stage leads to the planning stage of the next cycle. And again, for those of you who have studied anything about action research, you know that action research is a cyclical process. It theoretically never ends. The outcome of one cycle informs the beginning of the next cycle, and so on, and so on, and so on. It may branch off into different directions or different focal points, but the idea is that you're always investigating, studying, collecting data, making informed decisions, and reflecting on what you do and how you do it. The second diagram is one where the steps are spelled out a little bit more, but you see the same steps: planning, acting, developing, reflecting, and then the outcome going back and informing the next planning stage in that cycle. Some things about action research and sort of how I see this fit in. And just, I share these with you just sort of as a supporting notion. Some of you may have heard of Elizabeth City. She is the director of the doctoral program in educational leadership at Harvard's Graduate School of Education. And she has said this in a recent article: one thing that is maddening about research and policy is that they rarely tell you how to do something, particularly in your own context. That's partly because it's hard to be general and specific at the same time, and partly because research and policy don't know how to make it work in your context. Again, if you know anything about action research, that's exactly what she's talking about. A partial solution to the problem that she's identified here in my mind is job-embedded professional development through action research. You realize, too, that the other thing that she's really talking about here is we need to find some way to bridge the gap between policy and practice, between researcher and practitioner. And one of the things that I've argued about for many, many years is the notion that action research is a way to do that. It's not the only way to do it, but it is a way, in my mind, to effectively do that. The second of those 5 components, sources of data. I think when we talk about using data to drive any kind of instructional decision-making in which we engage, we typically have had a very narrow and limited view of what we use as data to inform these decisions. And part of this, admittedly, has been political, but I think part of it is that we just have not been as open as practicing educators to consider other sources of data. Typically, for many, many years when we talked about this, especially in the late 90s and into the early 2000s, we were only talking about standardized test scores. So we had standardized test scores, we would use those to drive instruction, and of course people argue, well, there's a lot more to what we do in our classrooms other than just how students perform on standardized tests. And we all know people, maybe including ourselves, who just because we don't perform well on standardized tests doesn't mean that we don't have the knowledge and the skills and so forth. Admittedly, very true. I don't take that perspective on using data for instructional or educational decision making. In fact, I would argue that there should be no limits to what you use for data in those kinds of decisions. As we know, educational institutions are full of data, But also, we have the capacity and the opportunity to collect different kinds of data to support things that we are trying to decide about. All right. Let me share with you a little bit of my perspective on data. And this is, I'm not going to read this one to you. I've enlisted the help of a colleague in a minute that I'll share with you. But this paragraph is from the preface of my book on interpreting standardized test scores. Let me play this for you and then I'll make a comment. So.
This comes from the preface of Dr. Craig Merdler's testing book. I honestly do not know anyone who loves standardized testing, but the standardized testing movement is not going away anytime soon. An examination of its impact on this country's educational system over the past 40 years will confirm that. Therefore, I approach it from this perspective, and I strongly suggest that all professional educators adopt a similar attitude. Anytime we are given the responsibility of making decisions about children, we need as much information as possible in order for those decisions to be as accurate as possible. We ask students questions. We ask them to read to us. We require them to write for us. We test them over units of instruction. We observe them. We encourage them to be creative. We engage them in performance-based tasks, etc. The results from standardized tests are just another source of information about student learning, about our teaching, and about our curriculum. Please use them as such. Add them to your long list of various sources of information about student learning. They can only help improve the accuracy of the decisions that we make about our students, as well as our own instruction.
Thank you for tolerating and bearing with me. That was just fun to do. And it was more fun than me reading that to you. So, but what I will say is that that really is my perspective, is that look at all of the things that we do with kids, even anecdotally. That's still information. Standardized test scores are just one piece of information. You know, back in the days when I was in school and took standardized tests, and many of you probably had a similar experience, the test reports came back to the school district. They were all separated. Then somebody went to all the file drawers with the CUNE folders in them and put your report in the file drawer, and of course, peeled off a little sticker and put it on the outside of your CUNE folder. Right? Everybody know what I'm talking about? We didn't use those test results for anything at all. Now there are districts and individual schools that have taken that kind of information and literally have made that part of the daily and annual way that they sort of operate in their schools. They get together and they look at student performance on those items. They factor that into the other kinds of data that they've collected within their classrooms, and then use that collectively to make decisions about curriculum and instruction and supporting materials and things like that. Okay? The third item that I want to talk with you about in that list of 5 is thinking differently. And if that sounds familiar, many of you may have been aware of or remember back in 1997, Apple Computer came out with an advertising campaign where it told people to think different. Well, the grammar person in me could not put think different on the screen. So I had to parenthetically add the ly. So I don't want you to think different. I want you to think differently. Okay? I mentioned some of these aspects earlier, but I think that they are vitally important in the overall scheme of trying to do some of these things that I'm suggesting. I think that we have to change the way we make decisions. Notice that I've highlighted the way we make decisions, not just the decisions that we make, but how we go about making them. And if you think about the information that we just talked about in terms of action research and a systematic process for collecting data, analyzing data, reflecting on what we've done, that's a different way of making decisions than what most of us have either done or been used to doing or perhaps were taught to do when we were in undergraduate programs, for example. I think we have to consciously choose to do things differently. And I've tried to highlight just a couple of examples that I want to just talk through with you very briefly. How many of you have heard of New York City's School of One? Only a couple people. When you get back to your campuses and your schools, get online and look up New York City's School of One. There are a couple of about 9 or 10-minute informational videos about this school. It was a school that was pilot tested in terms of what I'm going to describe to you a couple of years ago, I think. It's now expanded to a full-year program and is now expanded, I think, to 3 schools. But the thing that I find so amazing about this, and please don't get me wrong, I'm not advocating this approach, I'm not saying that I agree with everything that they're doing, but it's a phenomenal way to approach education. These are middle schools. And what they have done is found a way to customize and individualize instruction every day for every kid. And they do that by the first thing that students do when they come into school in the morning is that they take this sort of mini little pre-test on the standards or content that they're currently studying. And then based on what's identified as an area of weakness, and first of all, just an aside, realize that's some data-driven decision making, they then are matched up with the content that they need to study that day. Not only are they matched up with the content, they're also matched up with the method of delivery, which could be large group, small group, one-on-one tutoring, web-based computer instruction, computerized adaptive instruction. And these all come from the fact that at the beginning of the year, they do sort of these inventories of the kids about the way that they like to learn. This is one of those schools that when you see on the video, you go, oh my God, I'm glad I'm not the administrator in this building because it's chaotic in here. It's chaotic in here because all the kids are almost all of them are sort of doing their own thing. But the kids love it because they're learning what they think they need or what they have determined they need to learn, but also how they like to learn. And it really is an incredible thing. I'm not really sure how they pull it off, to be honest with you. But it's just an amazing thing to see. And on these little videos, they have interviews with some of the kids and how much they like coming to school and But it really is a very, very, in my mind, and I'm going to use one of my own words that I want to stress, a very innovative approach to differentiated and individualized instruction. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with parent trigger laws that are being thrown about now. Anybody not know what I'm talking about? Okay. Parent trigger laws, the first one started in Compton Unified School District in California. The idea behind parent trigger laws is the fact that if parents are not happy with an underperforming school, they have the option to petition the school district to have that converted to a charter school. Again, I'm not advocating it. I'm not saying that I agree with it necessarily, but you have to admit it's a unique approach to looking at underachieving schools and how to address them. There are many other states that are considering implementing parent trigger laws, and you just see a partial list there. But for those of you who are familiar with this and follow this in the news at all, you probably know that it was either late last week, I think it was late last week, apparently federal courts are now involved and have sort of put a stop to the parents in the Compton School District requesting this conversion to a charter school district without the district being able to provide any input into that. So these kinds of things are not done by any stretch of the imagination, but again, they're unique. The last one that I just threw up there was one that I think that everybody's familiar with, and you're only going to see this increase more and more in probably a very short period of time to come. And that's the increasing use of hybrid delivery models in K-12 learning. The idea that we've got more and more schools and school districts that are either relying on online courses or online components to coursework or entire subject areas that are online. For example, in Florida, there was an article in Education Week last week that Florida schools are considering removing all paper materials, instructional materials, from every one of their schools by 2015. Everything will be digital. All iPads, Kindles, and things like that. It will not have hardbound, paperback, paper textbooks after 2015. So this is the kind of thing. These are not, again, these are not new. We're not creating new things here. But we are engaging in some radical changes to how those things have been done in the past. This is Apple's video from that.
Here's to the crazy ones. The misfits. The rebels. The troublemakers. The round pegs in the square holes. The ones who see things differently. They're not fond of rules, and they have no respect for the status quo. You can quote them, disagree with them, glorify or vilify them. But the only thing you can't do is ignore them. Because they change things. They push the human race forward. And while some may see them as the crazy ones, we see genius. Because the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do.
I just love that. I think that's just a powerful little, 30-second. I love when that girl opened her eyes at the end. But that's the kind of thing. It's the idea that if you look at those people that are featured in that advertising campaign, in that commercial, these are people who don't think like the rest of us think. They think differently. They think about different kinds of things. They think about different kinds of solutions to problems. The fourth of those 5 components is collaboration. Now, first of all, let me start off by saying that I don't think that collaboration is a requirement in this model, but I do think that it can be highly beneficial if you integrate it into the things that I'm talking about. Professional collaborations can be very, very powerful. One of the things that they do is enable us to accomplish a lot more than we would if we were working individually. But as a precursor to that, one of the things that we have to do in order to collaborate effectively is that we have to abandon what one of my former Ohio State professors referred to as an egg crate mentality. The idea that we sort of all keep to our own little, 4 walls of our classroom or of our offices. And of course, we all collaborate to some degree. But if you truly think about really sort of innovative collaboration, that's something that I would argue that a lot of us, myself included, probably do not engage in nearly as often as we could in terms of really being able to reap the benefits of that kind of collaborative work. You obviously bring together different perspectives, different experiences, different ideas into that process that you couldn't do if you were working individually. The idea that there are multiple people that are working toward a common goal can again be very powerful, but of course that implies that you have to be sure that you're all on the same page with the common goal. And then finally, and this is, I think, a key component of collaboration, is that it encourages practitioners and researchers to work together. Again, an opportunity to help bridge that gap a little bit between policy and practice, researcher and practitioner. I think that collaboration can be very effectively integrated into this process in 2 ways, and I would almost argue that ideally those 2 things should be combined into one. One of those is collaborative action research, revisiting action research again, but also professional learning communities. And let's look at each of these just very quickly for a minute. Characteristics of collaborative action research. Well, as you could imagine, it's action research where people are collaborating together on action research. So, but if you think about it as an entity, it really, sort of capitalizing on the benefits of action research and the benefits of collaboration. Practitioners working together on it as a team, focusing on a common issue, problem, or goal. And again, if you can all be on the same page about what that common issue or goal is, then it can be very, very powerful, especially in terms of creating momentum for yourself as a collaborative group to continue to sort of strive forward and move toward innovative practices in which you might be engaged. Similarly, professional learning communities, if you're familiar with PLCs, you'll be very familiar with these 6 essential characteristics. And you'll also notice how many of them overlap with key characteristics of collaborative action research. A shared mission, values, goals, a collaborative culture, collective inquiry, collective, okay, an action orientation, learning by doing, or the integration of action research. A commitment to continuous improvement, and this is really important, an orientation that's focused on results, not on intentions. Okay? The idea that, you try something, it doesn't work, you sort of sit back and you're in that reflection stage and you say, well, we gave it a good go, we gave it our best, we tried, let's do something different now. Okay? It's got to be more than that. There has to be that commitment to those end results that you want to achieve. So the idea would be, if you get to the point where you haven't reached or achieved those results, then you go through another cycle and you continue working toward that until you've achieved those goals. And again, that's where there's that really strong integration of that trial and error process. Let me just throw something in as an aside. If you have, I've sort of alluded to this already, if you haven't really picked up on this, I hope that you do very soon, and that is that all 5 of these components, there's so much overlap and integration between them. That's why I think that as an overall model that I'm going to share with you in a few minutes, there really is just a logical integration of these things that makes a whole lot of sense on a whole lot of levels. The 5th and final component is reflection. The idea of reflective practice is the fact that educators study their own practice, they determine and make decisions what works best for their students. But one of the things that I think can be highly beneficial in terms of reflective practice is that it's an opportunity for people, for educators, to customize your own professional development. The idea that either individually or as a team, you identify things that you either want to improve upon or achievements that you want to see in students or whatever the case may be. And you do the things that you need to do to help yourself and your team get better at those things. This is very, very different, very innovative, if you will, compared to the predominant model of professional development, in particular in P-12 schools, where somebody decides what the focus is going to be for the year, and maybe you get a binder to go along with that. But then everybody gets that professional development, even if you're already good at it, or even if you don't use that in your classroom. Everybody gets it. And I realize that's not the only way to do professional development, but it is a very common way for professional development to be implemented. This gives you an opportunity to really customize and work on what you feel you need to work on. The other thing that I think reflective practice does is that it fosters professional learning that, excuse me, that is meaningful, ongoing, applied, and very purposeful. You have a purpose and a reason for doing it. It's because you have identified something that you want to improve upon. The idea, and this is just a process that we've really been talking about, educators identifying problems, collecting data, analyzing those data to improve performance. That whole thing is a direct result of practicing educators studying themselves and how they practice what it is they do on a daily basis. So let me just quickly review these 5 components. First of all, DDITM, that idea that we are sort of systematizing a process of decision making. The second component, data, the more the better. Of course, we also want them to be good data. They can't just be data for the sake of data. We want them to be good data. I need to throw that in there. Thinking differently, consciously choosing to do things differently from the way that we've done them before. Collaboration through the implementation of collaborative action research and professional learning communities, and professional reflection that fosters ongoing professional learning. I think what these 5 components collectively can do is allow for systematic, collaborative, data-driven investigations that not only allow for, but will promote transformational innovations in your setting at your level. I'm going to come back to that notion a little bit later. The idea that we don't necessarily have to wait for those things to get to us. We can take charge of them on our own. However, I do also believe that there is one very critical aspect that didn't deserve to be its own component, but I think it's integrated in and among all of these things, and that is that we have to be willing to be wrong sometimes. And we have to be comfortable with the notion of being wrong sometimes. We have to be able to learn from those mistakes. We have to use that information as a mechanism for continuing to kind of push ourselves to strive forward to achieve what it is we're trying to achieve. In our educational systems, and especially in this era of accountability, we tend not to promote a lot of wrong thinking. Students don't get partial credit on statewide achievement tests that are multiple choice for a wrong answer, even if they may have learned something from that wrong answer, correct? Okay? We don't promote that. What we promote with that sort of mindset is, there is only one right answer, and I need for you to find it, and I need for you to find it today. Preferably in the next hour and 15 minutes before I have you put your pencils down. Okay? I've got a little video clip. Oh, I'm sorry. I've got another quote from Elizabeth City, and then I've got another video clip to show you. This is another one that I think is very sort of telling and relates very closely to this. One of the limits to our current approach to goals, measuring, and accountability is that it rewards cautious behavior. When the stakes are high and we're not sure what to do, we try to do lots of little things in the hopes that some might be right and none might be wrong. We need movements that inspire innovation and experimentation, but only if it makes it okay to be wrong sometimes. We have to be willing to be wrong or we will never achieve greatness. In education, the fear of failure leads to many things. One of the most important is lack of imagination. This matters because there's a powerful connection between imagination and hope, and between hope and action. I really think there's a lot of truth there. We just don't, we try to do as much as we can and hopefully do as little damage as we can. Okay? I realize that there is a need for us to have that mindset, but I don't believe that it can be the permeating mindset that we have in everything that we do. One more thing about being wrong. This is a video clip from Sir Ken Robinson. Any of you know Ken Robinson? A couple of you? Okay. Ken Robinson is an internationally recognized leader in the development of creativity and innovation. He's given, over the last couple of years, a couple of talks as part of the TED Talks organization, and you can go online and find these full addresses, which I sort of stumbled on about 6 months ago, and I just think that they're incredibly powerful. And he has a way to really kind of relate those things. But let me share this brief clip with you.
What these things have in common is that kids will take a chance. If they don't know, they'll have a go. Am I right? They're not frightened of being wrong. Now, I don't mean to say that being wrong is the same thing as being creative. What we do know is, if you're not prepared to be wrong, you'll never come up with anything original. If you're not prepared to be wrong. And by the time they get to be adults, most kids have lost that capacity.
Several very important things, I think, in that little clip. You know, what I'm not saying is that we need to go out and be wrong. We just have to be prepared to be wrong. It has to be okay to be wrong. Being wrong is not, I don't think, should be equated with failing. I think it should be equated with learning from mistakes and using what we've learned in the next cycle of what we do. The simple fact that he's kind of stressed the idea that kids do this all the time. They're okay with it. You know, they'll put themselves out there. They'll get up in front of people they don't know and dance and sing. When's the last time any of you did that? No hands.
Reception last night.
Oh, Nick said at the reception last night. He did say that. I think that's a talk for a different day. But the idea that, as he said, that, you know, by the time people get to be adults, so many of us have lost that capacity to just say, hey, I don't care if I'm wrong. Okay? Granted, there are situations where we don't want to be wrong and where we don't want to admit that we're wrong. But the notion of being prepared to be wrong and then knowing how to deal with it when you are is, I think, huge. So with all of that, what I'd like to do then is to share with you this integrated model for transformational innovation. This is what the model looks like. I know you can't see the detail of this, but I'm going to show it to you in just a second. But at the center of this model is the notion of transformational innovation in education, and the 5 components that we discussed are around the outside. So let me show this to you and walk you through some of those aspects of the model. First of all, we need to think differently. We need to be able to choose to do things differently than we've done them before. We have to challenge the kinds of things that we take for granted. And of course, we have to be prepared to be wrong in the process of thinking differently. Second component, de-denim. The idea that we're going to take this art of teaching and transform it into the science of teaching. Again, not at the expense of the art of teaching, but in addition to. Okay? The third component of transformational innovation in education, data. And all I'll say about data is data, data, and more data. The more the better. The fourth component, collaboration through the implementation of collaborative action research and professional learning communities. The idea that we can always do more collectively than we can individually. And the strength, there's strength in numbers. And I think we need to capitalize on that, especially when we're trying to innovate and do things differently. And then the final component is reflective practice. That idea that we take all of these things, we use them as a mechanism for critically examining ourselves, our practice, what we do, how we do it. I think if you can integrate all 5 of those components, and you can do that effectively, what you will end up with is transformational innovations in the broad field of education. With that, let me share a couple closing thoughts with you. I really and truly firmly believe that we don't have to wait for these kinds of transformational innovations to filter down to us. I think that there are things like this model that we can use as a mechanism for empowering us in what we do and how we do it, so that we don't have to wait for somebody else to tell us what to do. A lot of this comes back to that contextual argument. Nobody knows what you do and how you do it and what you teach and how you teach and what your kids understand and what they don't better than you. So why are you waiting for somebody across the country to tell you what you should do? The concepts that I shared with you and the model are a mechanism for educator empowerment. The idea for you to take charge of some of these things on your own. The one thing that I do want to stress, though, is the idea of thinking differently, plus data-driven educational decision-making, plus lots and lots of data, plus collaborative action research and professional learning communities, plus professional reflection equals a process of transformational innovation. That doesn't mean you go through this one time. In all likelihood, you all will have transformed your practice. I don't want to lead you to believe that that's what I think or what I'm promoting. It's a process. It takes time. It takes going through those cycles a couple of times, maybe multiple times. But it's a process, and you have to be willing to sort of invest in the process. Finally, you may have noticed that on every slide I included that graphic over in the corner. And I wanted to explain to you why I did that. I sort of stumbled on this little image about a year and a half ago. And I liked it, and I'll tell you why I liked it. But I really sort of saw it as a very simple, visual way to summarize and kind of capture what I believe about these kinds of empowering notions. That, of course, is a little ripple. Well, I think that if you engage in these kinds of things in your context, in your settings, and you really buy into them, and you get colleagues to do them with you, that what you'll begin to see is that these kinds of innovative activities in which you engage will begin to permeate your workplace. They'll begin to permeate your school. They'll begin to permeate your college of education. Because I think people will see, and of course you have to help them see, the power of doing these kinds of things. But as that ripple expands and you bring more people into these processes, I just think that they stand to be incredibly and increasingly powerful over time. I want to share with you one parting thought. This is one more very brief video clip from Ken Robinson in one of his addresses talking about innovation.
Innovation is hard because it means doing something that people don't find very easy for the most part. It means challenging what we take for granted, things that we think are obvious.
Things that we take for granted, things that we think are obvious, things that we typically don't give a second thought to. If we start to critically examine those kinds of things, those innovative activities that we engage in can be very, very powerful. So with that, for your time and attention this morning, and sticking with our sort of beachy theme, I would just like to say thank you very much. I've appreciated your attention.